Karl Marx. Who is he? What is he? And what's his problem with my boy Proudhon? Well, he's only went and wrote a book about it. The Poverty of Philosophy. The cheeky boy. Inspired by, and criticism of, the philosophy of misery. Also known as the philosophy of poverty. Which is what he ripped off, basically, for the title. Cheeky little man, that Karl Marx. Bit of a parasite, too. If you look into his life, it's all over the internet. You would discover that Marx basically didn't have a job. He didn't pay for anything. Bit of a scrounger, didn't really bathe. Kind of a loafer. It's not surprising that he came up with a world system called communism, which is basically take from everybody, decide what everybody should have. Karl Marx doesn't really need introduction. Everybody knows Karl Marx. Well, most people do. I brought up Karl Marx to a guy at work, and he went, does he play for Tottenham? No, he doesn't. He might do, actually. I don't know. I don't follow football. But basically, Karl Marx, famous communist, he basically came up with authoritarian socialism. When people talk about the totalitarian state, the all-powerful machine, they're talking about Karl Marx. Don't be mistaken by the thickness of the Communist Manifesto. This is a gift version. The real version is tiny. It's just a handful of... It's about that big, really. All of this is fluff. But here's the thing. When I first got disenfranchised with capitalism, I turned to communism and Marx. I was reading what it was about, and I mistakenly read the Das Kapital first. I actually thought I got a bad translation because it is the most jargony, gobbledygook, difficult to understand. It's wordy. It's so goddamn wordy. Nothing's clear. Basically, he speaks in subjects. It's like saying the physics of the biology, of the PE, of the cookery, of the mathematics. And it's like, what is he actually talking about? So when I was reading Das Kapital, I needed a tablet and a notepad to read it. And I eventually got sick. And I was reading the back. And it said, people have been interpreting it for years. It's like, interpreting it? Why would you have to interpret it? Surely, you would just be able to say it straightforward. So I looked online, and it says that that's just how it's written. It wasn't a bad translation. It was well, the accusation is that it's intentionally obfuscated, because he was basically trying to hide what he really wanted. So after I read that, I went to the Communist Manifesto, and I got to the part when he's talking about super duper state socialism, where everything's gathered in to the whole centralized state, and that was when I realized, not for me. It was, because obviously that's a silly idea. Having one party in charge of absolutely everything. Transport, news, money, everything. Absolutely, the workplace. So that's what people mean when they mean communism. There's the anarcho-communists who, basically, if you say communism to them, they'll go, it means freedom. And it's like, well, that's what the anarcho-communists would have you believe, who I looked into, again, because I thought when my journey went communism, then anarcho-communism, and then I found mutualism, and it was a no turning back point, because they believe in the free market. They believe in free exchange, actual freedom, actual anarchy. The anarcho-communists don't really believe that. They believe in like a community justice. The difference between anarcho-communists and Marxist communists is that Marx wants a revolution and a state, super powerful state. And then, after you've walked into that super powerful prison, eventually, you'll be free. That's his argument. And that's what the anarcho-communists say. No, that's bullshit. That can't. You don't get to freedom by walking towards authoritarianism. That seems obvious. And that's why I think Marx was actually a fraud. I think there's a lot of subject matter like this going around back in those days. And I think Marx just soaked it up. And he saw the end of a system, basically. And he went, well, you know what, I'm gonna take a little bit of that and a little bit of the other, and I'm going to lure them all in to a perfect slavery. And then once I've got them, there's no getting out of it again. Just look at any of the... Well, you see, it is communism. Because people will say communism means freedom eventually. And that's why they say communism's never been tried. But the two flavors of communism are authoritarian communism, which I think is the final step of Marxist-type communism. There's no step beyond that. And anarcho-communism. So if you want to learn about communism, you want to learn about both types. Read Marx and anarcho-communism. Read them both, because this one's apparently meant to lead to this one, but that's impossible. You can't get to this from this. Impossible. But here's the more frustrating thing I found about Marx. And I was trying to find out what he really wanted from communism. It's a hard thing to find. When I was looking on YouTube and I would go on communist economics, I would find Russia and China. You know, that's not what Marxism was talking. I was wanting to find out what did Marx want to say. So I'd look for Marxist economics. And you'd get this, Capital. Now, for anybody who doesn't know, this book is a atomistic analysis of capitalism, not communism. Capitalism. So when you look into Marxism economics, you get fucking capitalism, which is like, what? Why isn't he talking about communism? So, the best idea to get about communism is the Communist Manifesto, or anarcho-communism. So there's my little introduction about Marx, there's my little journey that I've had. And here is where I discovered a little bit more about Marx. It's the poverty of philosophy. So this book was written before the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital. This is when Marx was fairly unknown, and he was a bit green. Him and Proudhon were still friends at the time, until this book was released. And it's interesting when you see his takes on things, when you see what he's vulnerable about, when you see what he attacks. Because you see a baby communism in this book. And you also see a kind of fancy for capitalists. It's weird. The way Marx argues in, I mean, we'll get to the review of this book. This is still just my introduction. But the way Marx argues, it almost sounds he fancies himself a capitalist and he sees communism as the natural step after it. Not really an overthrow, but kind of like it births out of it. It's a funny old thing. So that was my journey with Marx. That's why I'm not a communist, because it seems clear to me that when you have a state social superpower, they will never ever let go. And you just have to look at society. Look at the real world. There's power-hungry people, there's evil people, there's people who'll cut the grandmother's necks just to get into a position of power, to get into that unaccountable place where you can tell people what to do and take everything from them. These people exist. Now, in a communist world, they would do anything to get into the party, to get into the top. They'll do anything. They'll just take a beating. They'll go crawl through glass. And they'll get that position. And once they're in that position of all-powerful state, oh my God, you're in hell world. Because in communism, you've got no chance, you've got no options, you've got no competition. And how do they enforce this? How do you think? With force. It's going to be the most boots on the head, hand on the neck system you could possibly imagine. A system like this can't exist without absolute fucking pervasive, everywhere force. It goes against human nature to have your things taken off you and given to somebody else for them to decide who's going to get what and why. And it's just obviously a bad idea. So there's my little journey on Marxism. And if you want to see, obviously, mutualism, check out the video before this one, part 1. So now that little introduction's been done, we'll get into, finally, the poverty of philosophy. The preface of this book is done by Engels, and he considers Proudhon a utopian socialist. He brings up 2 other economists of the time, John Gray and Bray. And Bray was a communist. He comes up later on in the book. So what Engels does is, he clearly thinks that Marx forgot about somebody. He brings up a guy called Robertus, and he absolutely tears him a new one. He says Robertus is also a utopian socialist, because they all believe in labour money, labour-backed money. And it's interesting what he does. Basically, Engels proves it and Marx proves it in this book. Neither of them believe in the labour-backed money theory, which is interesting, because you would think a communist would, a socialist would, you'd think that, but they definitely are not in favour of labour-backed money. So when Engels does this evisceration of Robertus, it's funny that he brings up something good. He brings up the fact that he believes in labour-backed money, but it should be split into thirds and a capitalist and a landlord should get the other 2/3. The worker gets the third left over. Robertus isn't allowed to sit with us. And I'm glad Engels brought it up, because he's not one of us. He's not the Proudhon crew. I haven't read much about John Gray, or Bray yet, but I know Robert Owen is considered a utopian socialist as well. He's the father of the cooperative movement. Good guy. Like I say, I've read about him in the utopian socialists books and the cooperative books. What's so utopian about it? You know, what does utopian really mean? That it's impossible? What's impossible? To get rid of parasites? Doesn't sound too hard to me. But that's the preface of this book. The preface. When I'm quoting from this book, I'm going to say M. Proudhon quite a lot. I don't know why Marx writes it like this. M. Proudhon. Maybe it means Mr. or Master or Mrs. I've no idea. It should be PJ. So, M. Proudhon. Don't know why he says it. But anyway, here's a little quote from Marx. M. Proudhon has the misfortune of being peculiarly misunderstood in Europe. In France, he has the right to be a bad economist, because he is reputed to be a good German philosopher. In Germany, he has the right to be a bad philosopher, because he is reputed to be one of the ablest of French economists. Being both a German and an economist at the same time, we desire to protest against this double error. The reader will understand that in this thankless task, we have to often abandon our criticisms of M. Proudhon in order to criticize German philosophy, and at the same time give some observations on political economy. Karl Marx. You might recognize that voice. Channeling someone who you might know these days. So, now we get into it. The poverty of philosophy. Now, there's only 2 chapters in this book. But they're jam-packed with little bits. So this book really should be first half and second half. The very end of it has a few letters in, which I'm going to leave out, because they're just a summary of the book, talking to other people, basically. So the first chapter starts, focused on chapters 1 and 2, the most important ones of philosophy of poverty. So a regular thing happens in this book. Basically, Proudhon will describe something in a fairly clear way, and Marx can't stand it. He basically comes in and he adds things to it, or he redefines it, or spins it around, or gives him an impossible task to deal with. I learned a lot of funny ways of arguing in this book. But this chapter 1 starts with Proudhon describes the idea of exchange. He has something and he wants to exchange it with somebody, and that's how he explains it. And Marx has a really big issue with this. He basically says that because he's said that, he must acknowledge political economy. He must acknowledge a division of labour and the machine process and this and that, and the fact that producers actually can't exchange anything in political economy. Proudhon wasn't talking about political economy. He was talking about the act of exchanging. And Marx he has a massive issue with this. There's a line in here that says, when Proudhon says, I propose... Whoa, hang on, there you go. The line that Proudhon says when he's describing exchange, I turn to my collaborators in various functions. He repeats this over and over. Marx repeats that over and over again. He has a big problem with it, because it can't happen in political economy. But he's not talking about political economy, Proudhon. He's talking about just exchanging. So that's his major bone to chew on in the first chapter. What Marx does is he forces what Proudhon says into political economy all the time. Proudhon is basically talking about a concept of exchange or value or a system. He's basically coming up with a new thing. Every time he does, though, Marx comes along and says, see, I can't fit it into political economy. You need to dismiss it. It's not political economy. He's talking about a principle. Marx argues in a death by 1,000 cuts way. There's not one big thing I can tell you in this video. There's not one big Titan versus Titan. I was expecting that. I was hoping to find out exactly what Marx thought of Proudhon. And instead I found like a little bitey, little bit of corrections here, a little bit of corrections there. It's death by 1,000 cuts. Basically, the main argument Marx makes about Proudhon is he's wrong. And in a million little ways, he brings it up. And not in a way that destroys Proudhon's arguments or disproves it, you know. It's just saying he's wrong. So what the next one is Proudhon he made the mistake of saying this philosopher was he made the mistake of saying I'm the first one to notice the contradiction between use and exchange value in this way. And Proudhon's basically coming up with a new theory, mutualism, the economic science. So Proudhon has noticed the contradiction, and he's also noticed the thing behind it, the reason, and he's heading for that, and he's mentioned that in his book. It's clear to see. But what Marx does is go, other economists have noticed that, Lauderdale and Sismondi noticed it, Ricardo noticed it. It's like, all right, what else? Nothing else. That's his point. You're not the first one to notice it. This guy noticed it as well. But the difference is, these guys didn't go, this is an elephant in the room, and this is why everybody's miserable. This is a problem. These guys, it's like these other philosophers, that's Lauderdale, let's just say it. It's like they turned up to a murder scene and went, yes, somebody was shot. Yes, footprints are there. And Proudhon went, Jesus Christ, someone's been shot. He went that way. There's a difference between noticing something and communicating a problem with it. Marx is basically saying, look, somebody else noticed it too. Nitpicky. Let's blow the dust off this one. Redefinition. Wow, I can say it now. But basically, redefinition is the favourite tool of control freaks. And it comes up again in this. Proudhon describes use value and exchange value in a fairly clear way. Clear enough for me to understand it. But Marx isn't happy with that. He redefines it. He redefines use value. Let's see if I can find it. He has to redefine use value to... He redefines exchange value with scarcity and use value with abundance. So when you read that paragraph, he redefines the term so many times, it's impossible to track. You don't know what the hell he's talking about anymore, which is a regular thing in these kind of debaters' books. They confuse you. They get you in circles. They're not clear. So after basically embarrassing Proudhon and saying, look, he's missed a bit, still cleaning, but he's missed a bit, he goes for the throat, goes for the jugular, goes for Proudhon's constitutional value, which in mutualism is utility and labour time. That's how you measure it. So basically, I'll just give a quick rundown of it. In a single social gathering of wealth, if your labour product is worth something, and you can exchange it to somebody else's useful product, and the way you measure it is how long you took on it. That's the fairest way. He calls it constitutional value, Proudhon. So what Marx does is he takes this and he intentionally or unintentionally, I don't know, but he redefines it again, I guess. Yes, he redefines it. He basically mischaracterizes it. He forces it into political economy. What he does is he takes the observation that in political economy, people are paid for their labour. The cost of labour is different in mutualism than it is in political economy, or the economic science that what Proudhon's talking about. The cost of labour in his day was the minimum wage. It was subsistence living, the absolute lowest somebody could be paid by the capitalist, by the owner, and then they take their product and sell it for whatever the hell they want. So Marx tries to make the argument that Proudhon has just discovered that. So very dishonest, because Proudhon describes that, the constitutional value, in the clean, explained way, where people can just exchange things. It makes sense. It makes sense that a product that's worthwhile is as valuable as somebody else's worthwhile product. And the only fair way to exchange it is how much time you've spent on it in a shared wealth. When you have a product that's not worth anything, it's not worth anything in a shared wealth. But if it's needed, it's needed. And your labour is as worthy as anybody else's labour if it's needed in a same system. But Marx just completely ignores that. And he goes, all Proudhon's doing is rediscovering the minimum wage. He's rediscovering the subsistence living of the slave workers in this system. And that's very dishonest. And it's something that Marx does continually in this book, saying that it's a funny way of arguing, and I've noticed it. But he says that Proudhon's rediscovering things that have already been discovered. It's a common thing that he does. It's a common strategy, saying that Proudhon's noticed this, but this guy noticed it as well. Proudhon's bringing up this, but we already know about this, and it's the same thing. But it's not, because Proudhon's talking about a new system. He's talking about how it should be. And Marx is going, but political economy, though, we can't get out of this. This is what everything needs to be added into. So he's taking mutualism and he's forcing it into political economy where it doesn't belong. It's like taking a chess piece and trying to put it in a Connect 4. It's like, you can't get it in the top. And, I can't make 4. This one moves diagonally. But you can't move it diagonally. You have to go straight down. It's not the same game. But Marx is trying to put mutualism principles in political economy. It's a common argument strategy that he does. And every now and then Marx shows his hand. He shows his capitalist fancying hand. And here's something that's surprised us. Because, like I say, you would think a communist or a socialist or a working class guy would have a little bit more humanity to the common man, to the worker. But here's something I need to bring up. This is absolutely important. It's hard to figure out what Marx really thinks. When he argues in this book, he'll make statements, and he'll also send out other economists to attack Proudhon. It's hard. He very rarely will say, I think this. A communist thinks that. He's kind of like sending out other people's Pokemon to attack Proudhon's Charizard. He'll be like, Ricardo's got a Bulbasaur. Or, Sismondi's got a fucking Mew. Get out there. And then you go, all right, what kind of Pokemon trainer are you, Marx? This guy's got a Zapdos. And it's like, what does he think? And it's tough to find out what Marx thinks. Very strategic. Very hard to pin down Marx. Because when he's arguing in this book, he'll make isolated statements, and it's hard to know whether he thinks that or whether he's observing it about political economy. So you can't really pin Marx down. I think that's another one of his strategies. But getting back to the thing that this working class hero man should have been behind. He comes up with the idea. He doesn't come up with it. Marx would have us for that. Because other people have came up with it first, which means I'm completely wrong. Marx he seems to be in favour of the value of labour being the cost of labour, as in subsistence living. He argues that labour is a commodity. It's the most inhuman thing you could possibly say. Labour is a commodity. You can be bought. You can be paid for by something. And what's the thing? What's the price of paying for you? The sustenance, what it means to keep you alive. Let's quote him.
To sum up, labor being itself a commodity is measured as such by the labor time needed to produce the labor commodity. And what is needed to produce this labor commodity? Just enough labor time to produce the objects indispensable to the constant maintenance of labor. That is, to keep the worker alive and in a condition to propagate his race.
What a lovely term. I didn't make that up.
The worker alive and in a condition to propagate his race. The natural price of labor is no other than the minimum wage.
How lovely. Later on he describes the worker as being a free worker. Now, how free is that worker really? Is it really selling your labor if you have no choice but to work or die? He shows his slave owner a little bit. When he says that free, let's just take an example. A free worker goes to the factory and he goes, hello, I am a free worker and I wish to sell you my labor. And the capitalist goes, I will give you sustenance living. No, thank you. I will simply not work. And he goes and he doesn't work. And he tries to go back to those feudal fields, that are owned by somebody else now. Hello, I'd like to go back home, please, and hunt in these forests and drink out of the river. No, actually, they belong to Lord Thistlewick III and I will kill you if you try to use them. Oh, fudge. And then he goes back to the factory. Seems to have been a slight misunderstanding. I must work or I'll die. Yes, I know. Free workers, selling labour, buying the labour commodity. His inner slave master came out there, didn't it? In the Philosophy of Misery, Proudhon comes up with an analogy for society. It's called Prometheus. Basically, he has society as a single god who comes alive in the world, like we do, basically, and he works. And the more he works, the more he produces. It's something called labour leaving in excess. And Marx will I'll come back to this. Marx borrows a lot from Proudhon. If you read Das Kapital, you realise there's a lot of echoes here from Proudhon. He calls it surplus value, Marx. But what Proudhon describes as labour leaving in excess is the concept of when we work, we make more than we produce. And the analogy of Prometheus is society works and it makes a lot of things. And the more stuff it has, and it never actually eats it, life should be better. Life should be easier because we never actually consume everything that we make. Labour leaves an excess and it gets more the more people you have. There's some weird force that comes online when lots of people come together. Like one person raising a pillar can't do it, but 100 men can raise a pillar. There's a new weird force that comes along, and Proudhon calls that labour leaving an excess. There's more than we can consume, and he puts the analogy of that as a guy called Prometheus, a god. Karl Marx has an issue with that, and he attacks it in the following way. He knows what surplus labour is. He mentions it. And he misses the point on Proudhon's Prometheus. He indicates that the god Prometheus, this society, would eat everything it produced. What an interesting way of looking at it. Maybe that's how Marx would lead his system. He would have you believe that Prometheus, there was no excess after he worked, that he ate everything every day, and that he would have to have worked twice in a row for no reason to have it on one day. I mean, I know that sounds a bit gobbledygook, but you know, you get what I'm talking about. You start, you work, you have an excess. In the way Marx says it is, you start, you work, and you're always consuming what you make. That's not the case. The way Marx is talking about Prometheus is actually more like Saturn, who ate his babies. And I think it's an interesting comparison between mutualism and communism. In the whole capitalist fancying thing, Marx lets it slip that he seems to be in favour of supply and demand. He also seems to be in favour of a gold-backed currency, of a relative value in between the product and the producer. He definitely is not in favour of the labour theory of interest in labour theory of value. Something that comes up when you're trying to study Marx is the labour theory of value. And almost every video starts with, it wasn't actually Marx's, it was Adam Smith's and Ricardo's. That's the case. You basically copy and pasted Adam Smith and Ricardo. Marx doesn't really have his own labour theory of value. Proudhon has a spectacular labour theory of value, but you won't hear his because it's anti-capitalist. Marx is basically an analysis of the capitalist one. He seems to fancy Ricardo quite a bit. And getting back to the relative value thing, he seems to be in favour of a token being given to the worker for his sustenance and his product going to the capitalist. And the capitalist decides what he sells it for. Communism is an evolution, not a revolution, of capitalism. But getting back to Bray, this is an interesting one, because he brings up Bray, a communist, to attack him. Which is good old Marx. Good old having a buddy like Marx. So he brings up his fellow communist Bray, who's in favour of labour theory. I keep doing it again. Labour money. He's in favour of labour money. So Marx attacks that. He does a ridiculous thing where he compares one guy working more hours than the other guy and having labour value left over in his tokens. And his major problem with this is that it leads to overproduction and idleness. What's this guy going to do with his extra labour? Sit around and do nothing? Yeah, that's what he's going to do. He's going to enjoy it. He's going to wait and spend it later. What's wrong with that? So to wrap up that chapter, that's the first half, is that Proudhon has discovered nothing new. Nothing to see, move along. That's the overall feel you get from Marx's criticism of Proudhon. Everything's already been discovered. Go away, folks. Look at Ricardo, look at Sismondi. Never mind, it's nothing new. Like I say, he's misquoted him, he's redefined him, he's set him impossible tasks. It's a hit job. It's a hit piece. It's a smear. I don't know why Marx is so... Well, yeah, I do know why. Because he was about to come up with communism. But you can see the fear. You can see that he didn't like exchange because he wasn't in favour of exchange. He wasn't in favour of a free market. So it wraps up with basically saying, nothing to see here, move along. Chapter 2, The Metaphysics of Political Economy. The second half of this book starts off with, based off a line that Proudhon said in The Philosophy of Misery, where he says anybody talking about political economy is essentially a metaphysician. So Marx has taken that with the start of his new chapter. So basically this one is the book condensed. He takes a big shot at how Proudhon thinks. That's the main That's how it starts. He does like 7 observations about basically calling him an idiot. And then he takes 2 chapters at the same time of Philosophy of Misery and talks about them in a summary kind of way. So the observations he makes, these are essentially, just calling Proudhon stupid, but to fly over them, he says that, Marx says that, social relations aren't eternal, they're born of the economic era. And I disagree with that, because if that was the case, there would be no such thing as a miserable slave or a paranoid landlord. He says that when describing one thing, Proudhon doesn't mention the step before it. Fine. Okay. Everything he sees in a good and bad dualistic way. That's true. But then Marx puts words in Proudhon's mouth by saying how he would be speaking positively of slavery. He says that the order of economic stages in this book are incorrect. That may be the case. You might have him on that one. He claims Proudhon's universal reason. Karl Marx changes it to something called human society. This is when you see his mechanical robot brain come in. He doesn't understand this whole universal law thing, this moral law that everybody has. Marx has trouble with it, and he calls it this human society. But basically, something that comes up a lot in this chapter is that Marx is trying to convince the reader that Proudhon's arguing for equality and not justice. And that's what he really mentions in that bit. But the main one, the first one he says, it's that Proudhon uses the Hegelian method incorrectly. That's the kind of insult that Fraser Crane gives Niles. But I'd imagine that actually hurt Proudhon quite a bit because he likes it. He uses it quite a lot in this. And actually, Karl Marx said he introduced him to it. So, a bit of a personal burn, that one.
M. Proudhon has nothing of Hegel's dialectics but the language. For him, the dialectic movement is the dogmatic distinction between good and bad.
But there is some middle ground between Marx and Proudhon. Something that's clear as day in this is that Marx somewhat agrees with Proudhon on some levels, but he doesn't really want to admit it. There's a weird kind of professional rivalry going on here, and you'll see that in Das Kapital when he basically borrows a lot from Proudhon, and he acknowledges any criticisms of it. So here's a quote to cover that.
He thinks he is constructing the world by the movement of thought, whereas he is merely reconstructing systematically and classifying by the absolute method the thoughts which are in the minds of all.
And then he finishes these observations with a big peacock flare and a jumping spinning roundhouse kick to Proudhon's face, in Karl Marx's view anyway. He's a clever guy, Karl Marx, you have to give him that. He knows way more philosophers, way more economists than poor little Proudhon does. And this is the section when he really puffs his chest out. So here's the quote that finishes it.
Thus it is that M. Proudhon flatters himself on having given criticism of both political economy and communism. He is beneath them both. Beneath the economists, since as a philosopher who has at his elbow a magic formula, he thought he could dispense with going into purely economic details. Beneath the socialists, because he has neither the courage nor the insight enough to rise, be it even speculatively, above the bourgeois horizon. He wants to be the synthesis. He is a composite error. He wants to soar as the man of science above the bourgeois and the proletarians. He is merely the petty bourgeois, continually tossed back and forth between capital and labour, political economy and communism.
Then Marx moves on to taking on division of labour and machinery at the same time. And again, like I say, he argues, he misquotes it, because it's clear that Proudhon was arguing for efficiency and the positive side of division of labour. But what Marx, again, tries to bring up is that he was trying to argue for equality. That makes sense. Marx is a big forcing everybody to be the same kind of guy. And he's muddying the waters on what Proudhon's real message was. So that's what he says about the division of labour. And on that as well, actually, he does bring up one point that it kind of rattled my birdcage a bit. And I almost became a communist right there on reading this. So basically he embarrasses Proudhon. It's a shame because I had so much in Proudhon. And when I came to this scene, it was like, Jesus Christ, I've been following a lie all this time. Basically what happens is Proudhon mentions an economist called J.B. Say. And he says that J.B. Say was the first economist to notice that the division of labour, even though it was good and production and all this kind of stuff, it was the sole purpose of why everything was so bad. And Karl Marx brings up that it was actually Lemony who thought of it first. Oh, damn it! Damn it, Proudhon! He doesn't know who Lemony is! Shit! All this time I've been reading Proudhon's books and he didn't know who Lemony was? Lemony! Oh! So after that boom headshot, Marx cruelly continues to actually criticize Proudhon with even more pages of this book. When he talks about machinery, he makes the point that it's the anarchy and the competition in society that brings the misery and the inefficiency of all of these machines. He brings up a baby communism as its fix.
If one took a model of the division of labor in a modern workshop in order to apply it to a whole society, the society best organized for the production of wealth would undoubtedly be that which had a single chief employer, distributing the tasks to the different members of community according to a previously fixed rule.
Command economy, no exchange. Then he takes on competition and monopoly at the same time. Doesn't really say a whole lot about competition, only that it's very, very bad and creates probably more problems than anything else. And then, would you believe it, argues in favour of monopoly. But the way he does it is really funny. He says that monopoly isn't the antithesis of competition. It's actually the synthesis of it. Now, how does he come up with that? He says that feudal monopoly was the antithesis of competition. And when those two were put together, the synthesis of modern monopoly came along. And then he takes police and taxation, and he doesn't even mention them. He just wafts them away, dismisses them. And of course he does. Because communism is all about police and taxation. He mentioned that in the Communist Manifesto. He needs to enforce people. He needs police. He needs policing. He needs all of those invasive rules. And he needs to feed himself with taxes. So, police and taxation, some of the best chapters in Philosophy of Misery, are just swatted away. We will not take them seriously. Which brings us to the fabled Book 2. This is when Marx starts talking about Tome 2, chapters 8, which is, chapter 9, which is the one that came after the responsibility of man and God, and the end of Philosophy of Misery. So how does this one start? Would you believe it? It talks about property. Can you believe that? Marx versus Proudhon on property? The guy who famously killed property and what is property? And Karl Marx locking horns on property? No, that's not what we get. He just kind of tiptoes around it with the following quote.
To try to give a definition of property as of an independent relation, a category apart, an abstract and eternal idea, can be nothing but an illusion of metaphysics or jurisprudence. M. Proudhon, while seeming to speak of property in general, deals only with landed property, with rent.
He misses out property, and he goes straight for rent. So Proudhon versus Marx on rent. Basically, they don't want to say where it originally came from. They can't really answer that. I think I can. It came from conquest. It came from somebody landing on a land and going, work for me or I'll kill you. Give us money or I'll kill you. Give us me cut. Give us protection money. I think that's where rent came from. But these guys both they don't want to say where it came from. They're arguing how it's figured out. So, Proudhon says, they both really fight over Ricardo's theory of rent and their interpretation of it. So Proudhon thinks that rent is figured out in the following way. Say you have a fertile field, and that fertile field grows a lot of fruit. It grows a lot of veg, or whatever you want to call it, produce. It's very productive. And there's a landlord there already, because they don't talk about originally where the landlord payer came from. Because who would pay a landlord anything if you all had the ownership of a land? Who would end up voluntarily paying a landlord something? Nobody. It has to come from conquest. So let's just presume that the landlord's there. A fertile field would produce more, and an infertile field would produce less. Now the landlord has to keep these guys working. He has to give them a reason to stay there and work. So he has to leave them with subsistence. So if the landlord takes subsistence off the guy with a shitty field and the guy with an amazing field, the guy with an amazing field will pay more. He will have more produce to take from, and you leave him with his subsistence. You leave the other guy with his subsistence as well. And you take less off him because he didn't grow as much. And Proudhon argues that's where rent came from. The more fertile land is a higher rent, more productive, and a less fertile field is less rent, less productive. Marx doesn't seem to agree with this. He says that rather than a landlord stealing from the worker, it's actually a case that the worker is the capitalist. and somehow he's denying the landlord something by his work and his way of organising things and his market. I didn't really pick up the way he was arguing about it. It was weird, in all honesty. He almost makes the landlord look like a victim. And I couldn't fathom what Marx was saying on this one, I'll be honest. I've read it a few times. Basically, they disagree. And they're fighting over Ricardo like two parents fight over a kid. They both want Ricardo on their side, which again tells me that Marx kind of fancies himself as a capitalist economist. He ingratiates them a lot. Strikes and combination of workers. This is an interesting chapter to finish on. Obviously, I can't say anything about Tome 2 because I've never read it. I don't know what's in there. I'm presuming these are the last chapters of that book. But it would add up that Marx would leave this to the end because he's basically pushing communism or trade unionism in this one. So strikes and combination of workers. Proudhon argues that a strike in this society would just raise prices. So if, let's say, a strike, and I'm in favour of strikes, by the way, but not as a money thing, it's a choking of the capitalist thing. But if strikers in, say, in a factory went, we want more money, and the factory owner would go, I don't want to pay you more money, but pay us more money. And then the factory owner does. He would simply just raise the price of his product to cover it, because the factory owner is never going to suffer. So that was Proudhon's argument, that a strike would just raise prices down the line. Marx disagreed with that. He was more in favour of it would have way more of an impact. And he's massively in favour of it. Like I say, I'm in favour of strikes. But it's as a more of a class-conscious thing, as a way of reminding labourers, we have the say, we have the control, we make everything. So, weirdly enough, I would disagree with Proudhon on this one. But this might be the power of Marx's misquotes. I haven't read that second book. So, this is the funny thing about this book, the Poverty of Philosophy. If you haven't read The Philosophy of Misery, you might get sucked into thinking Proudhon thinks a certain way, and you probably disagree with him. I haven't read book 2. He might have misquoted him here. I don't know. I've never heard Proudhon's opinion on strikes. I guess I have now, with Marx quoting him. But he, like I say, so Karl Marx wraps this up, essentially, with his push for communism.
Does this mean that after the fall of the old society, there will be a new class domination culminating in a new political power? No. The condition of the emancipation of the working class is the abolition of all classes, just as the condition for the emancipation of the third estate of the bourgeois order was the abolition of all estates and of all orders. The working class, in the course of its development, will substitute the old civil society, an association which will exclude classes and their antagonisms, and there will be no more political power, properly so called, since the political power is precisely the official expression of antagonism in civil society. Meanwhile, the antagonism between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie is a struggle of class against class, a struggle which, carried to its highest expression, is the total revolution.
Then the book moves on to a few letters that Marx writes to a few guys, and it's essentially the same letter over and over again. It's his book condensed, and he takes a shot at John Gray in that, another guy who believes in labour money theory. So I'm going to leave those bits out because it's essentially what we've already heard now. So that brings us to the end of the Poverty of Philosophy. What does it tell us about Marx? What did I learn from this? It tells me that he fears Proudhon for some reason. That's all I really need to know, because when I was looking into Proudhon, I was like, this works. This is correct. This is how the system works. And looking into Marx, I found it very, very obfuscating. I found like he was almost trying to hide something. He was trying to conceal what he really thought. Even in the Communist Manifesto, when it's talking about the accusations that come up, that people are saying the communists are against marriage and property and nationality. Well, the workers never had them anyway. It's like, well, are ya? You know, it's like, and he lists his list. And you go, holy shit, that's terrible. You know, like a central bank and this stealing property off rebels and immigrants. And it was like, but that whole description of communism, it's very loosey-goosey. It's very dodgy. It's even the way Marx argues in this, like I said earlier, it's very indirect. It's very, is he saying it? Does he think it? honestly, I've read 3 books of Marx now, and I've watched a ton of YouTube videos about him. I don't know what to think about Karl Marx. He's a mystery. He's, like I say, intentionally misleading. I think he's intentionally misleading, which tells me that he's hiding something. And when I've been looking into this whole movement, this whole social movement, these 200-year-old books, my personal theory is there was a lot of people talking about this back then. And the writing was on the wall with the invention of machines, with the class consciousness, the awareness. Everybody was noticing the evil of capitalism, and it was about to be overthrown. And I think Marx was actually an inside man. He soaked up all of this knowledge, and he was like, guys, if we want slaves, we're going to have to fucking do something here. Like, we're going to have to pretend to be one of them. And, because, these anarcho-communists and these utopian socialists and these mutualists, they're all going to free people. They're all going to have people working for themselves again. Shit, we can't have that. What are we going to do? We lure them into the perfect prison system. Communism, state socialism. It's the last gasp. It's the last gasp of the workers, because machines free the workers. I think Karl Marx was a fraud. And it comes across in his writing. His intentional hiding of what he really thinks, his using other people's arguments, overly critical of things, and not really putting his stamp on it. Like, he'll analyze, I've already said, a murder scene. He'll analyze a murder scene by just mentioning what's there, and not really alarming anybody as to the motive or the crime of it. I'm surprised Marx is such the intellectual that he is in the left movement. I would much rather people be down with Robert Owen instead, the utopian socialists, and obviously Proudhon, who I'm a big fan of. These are real working class movements. And if you consider yourself on the left and you're a fan of Marx, you're really a fan of authority. You're really a fan of boots on the neck, hand on your throat. You've got more common with capitalists than you do with actual leftists, I would say. And I know what Karl Marx has said, he's like the king of the left and stuff like that. But he's not in favour of the people owning the means of production. The state does. And if the state does, and the unchallengeable, nobody does. Nobody owns the means of production if the state does. That's one guy. So have a think, people who call themselves Marxists. Consider Proudhon. Consider libertarian socialism, mutualism. And if you're a statist, consider cooperativism. Look into Robert Owen. So, this journey was a very interesting one. I still feel like Marx is a bit of an enigma. Haven't been swayed from Proudhon. He's still the working class hero that I thought he was. And I would fly his flag, and I will not be swayed by hit pieces like this, especially if they don't have the balls to put on paper exactly what they think. Lemony!